Man, oh my god. Fucking, okay. Haven't done one of these in so fucking long. Oh, I do hope we're gonna finish this book today. Fucking. Ooh, that's 2 chapters. Ooh, I don't know now. Where the fuck did we stop? Oh my gosh. I think this is where we stopped. Page 318. I'll just continue from here. I'm too sleepy to actually interrogate my previous blogs. Okay. In August 1935, 2 months before the EPR paper was published, Einstein finally bought a house. There was nothing to distinguish 112 Mercer Street from its neighbors, but because of its owner, it became one of the most famous addresses in the world. It was conveniently located within walking distance of his office at the Institute for Advanced Study, although he preferred to work in his study at home. Located on the first floor, a large table covered with the usual paraphernalia of the scholar dominated the center of the study. On the walls there were portraits of Faraday and Maxwell, later joined by one of Gandhi. The small clapboard house with its green shutters was also home to Elsa's younger daughter Margot and Helen Dukas. All too soon, the domestic tranquility was shattered as Elsa was diagnosed with heart disease. As her condition worsened, Einstein became miserable and depressed. Elsa wrote to a friend, "She was pleasantly surprised. I never thought he was so attached to me. That, too, helps." She died aged 60 on this 20th of December 1936. With 2 women to look after him, Einstein quickly came to terms with his loss. "I am settling down splendidly here," he wrote to Bourne. "I hibernate like a bear in his cave, and really feel more at home than ever before in all my varied existence." He explained that this bearishness has become accentuated still further by the death of my mate, who was more attached to human beings than I. Bourne found Einstein's almost casual announcement of Elsa's death rather strange, but unsurprising. For all his kindness, sociability, and love of humanity, Bourne said later, he was nevertheless totally detached from his environment and the human beings included in it. Almost. There was one person to whom Einstein was deeply attached, his sister Maya. She came to live with him in 1939 after Mussolini's radical laws forced her to leave Italy, and stayed until her death in 1951. After Elsa's death, Einstein established a routine that, as the years passed, varied less and less. Breakfast between 9 and 10 was followed by a walk to the Institute. After working until 1 p.m., he would return home for lunch and a nap. Afterwards, he would work on his study until dinner between 6:30 and 7. If not entertaining guests, he would return to work until he went to bed around 11 and 12. He rarely went to the theater or a concert, and unlike Bohr, hardly ever watched a movie. He was, Einstein said in 1936, living in the kind of solitude that is painful in one's youth, but in one's more mature years is delicious. In early February 1937, Bohr arrived at Princeton together with his wife and their son Hans for a week-long stay as part of a 6-month world tour. It was the first opportunity that Einstein and Bohr had had to meet face-to-face since the publication of the EPR paper. Could Bohr finally convince Einstein to accept the Copenhagen interpretation? The discussion on quantum mechanics was not at all heated, but called Valentin Bargmann, who later served as one of Einstein's assistants. But to the outside observer, Einstein and Bohr were talking past each other. Any meaningful discussion, he believed, required days and days. Alas, during the encounter he witnessed, so many things were left unsaid. What was left unsaid between them, each man already knew. The debate about the interpretation of quantum mechanics came down to a philosophical belief about the status of reality. Did it exist? Bohr believed that quantum mechanics was a complete fundamental theory of nature. And he built his philosophical worldview on top of it. It led him to declare, there is no quantum world. There is only an abstract quantum mechanical description. It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. Einstein, on the other hand, chose the alternative approach. He based his assessment of quantum mechanics on his unshakable belief in the existence of a casual, observer-independent reality. Consequently, he could never accept the Copenhagen interpretation. What we call science, Einstein argued, has the sole purpose of determining what is. For Bohr, the theory came first, then the philosophical position, the interpretation constructed to make sense of what the theory says about reality. Einstein knew that it was dangerous to build a philosophical worldview on the foundations of any scientific theory. If the theory is found wanting in the light of new experimental evidence, then the philosophical position it supports collapses with it. It is basic for physics that one assumes a real world existing independently from any act of perception, said Einstein, but this we do not know. Wow, that's kind of deep. Anyways, what commentary? Einstein was a philosophical realist and knew that such a position could not be justified. It was a belief concerning reality that was not susceptible to proof. While that may be so, for Einstein it is existence and reality that one wishes to comprehend. I have no better expression than religious for confidence in the rational nature of reality insofar as it is accessible to human reason, he wrote to Maurice Solavine. Wherever this feeling is absent, science degenerates into uninspired empiricism. Heisenberg understood that Einstein and Schrödinger wanted to return to the reality concept of classical physics, or to use a more general philosophical term, to the ontology of materialism, the belief in an objective real world whose smallest parts exist objectively in the same sense as stones or trees exist, independently of whether or not we observe them, was for Heisenberg a throwback to the simplistic materialistic views that prevailed in the natural sciences of the 19th century. Heisenberg was only partly right when he identified that Einstein and Schrödinger wanted to change the philosophy without changing the physics. Einstein accepted that quantum mechanics was the best theory available, but it was an incomplete representation of real things, although it is the only one which can be built out of the fundamental concepts of force and material points, whereas quantum corrections to classical mechanics. Einstein was desperately seeking to change the physics as well, for he was not the conservative relic many thought. He was convinced that the concepts of classical physics would have to be replaced by new ones. Since the macroscopic world is described by classical physics and its concepts, Bohr argued that even to seek to go beyond them was a waste of time. He had developed his framework of complementarity in order to save classical concepts. For Bohr, there was no underlying physical reality that exists independently of measuring equipment, and that meant, as Heisenberg pointed out, we cannot escape the paradox of quantum theory, namely the necessity of using the classical concepts. It is the Bohr-Heisenberg call to retain classical concepts that Einstein called a tranquilizing philosophy. Einstein never abandoned the ontology of classical physics and observer independent reality, but he was prepared to make a decisive break with classical physics. The view of reality endorsed by the Copenhagen interpretation was all the evidence he needed of the necessity to do so. He wanted a revolution more radical than the one offered by quantum mechanics. It was hardly surprising that Einstein and Bohr left so much unsaid. How much is left? Holy shit. Fuck. In January 1939, Bohr returned to Princeton and stayed for 4 months as a visiting professor at the institute. Although the two men still enjoyed a warm, friendly relationship, their ongoing dispute over quantum reality had inevitably led to a cooling. Einstein was only a shadow of himself, recalled Rosenfeld, who had accompanied Bohr to America. They did meet, usually at formal receptions, but they no longer talked about the physics that mattered so much to them. During Bohr's day, Einstein gave only one lecture on his search for a unified field theory. With Bohr in the audience, he expressed the hope that quantum physics would be derivable from such a theory, but Einstein had already made it known that he would rather not discuss the issue further. Bohr was profoundly unhappy about this, said Rosenfeld. With Einstein unwilling to talk about quantum physics, Bohr found that there were plenty of others in Princeton eager to discuss the latest developments in nuclear physics, given the ominous events in the world that would lead once again to a world at war. No matter how deeply one immerses oneself at work, Einstein wrote to Queen Elizabeth of Belgium, a haunting feeling of an inescapable tragedy persists. The letter was dated 9th of January 1939, 2 days before Bohr sailed for America and brought with him the news of a discovery that others had made, the splitting apart of a large nucleus into smaller nuclei, with an accompanying release of energy, or nuclear fission. It was during the voyage that Bohr realized it was the uranium-235 isotope that undergoes nuclear fission when it is bombarded by slow-moving neutrons and not uranium-238. At the age of 53, it was Bohr's last major contribution to physics. With Einstein unwilling to debate the nature of quantum reality, Bohr concentrated on working out the details of nuclear fission with the American John Wheeler from Princeton University. After Bohr returned to Europe, Einstein sent a letter dated the 2nd of August to President Roosevelt, urging him to examine the feasibility of developing an atomic bomb, given that Germany had stopped the sale of uranium ore from mines it now controlled in Czechoslovakia. Roosevelt replied in October, thanking Einstein for his letter and informing him that he had set up a committee to investigate the issues raised. In the meantime, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany attacked Poland. Still a pacifist, Einstein was prepared to compromise until Hitler and the Nazis were defeated. In a second letter, dated 7th of March 1940, he urged Roosevelt that more needed to be done. Since the outbreak of the war, interest in uranium has intensified in Germany. I have now learned that research there is carried out in great secrecy. Unknown to Einstein, the man in charge of the German nuclear atomic bomb program was Werner Heisenberg. Once again, the letter failed to solicit much of a response. Bohr's discovery that it was uranium-235 that underwent fission was far more important to the creation of the atomic bomb than anything achieved by Einstein's 2 letters to Roosevelt. The American government did not seriously begin thinking about developing an atomic bomb, codenamed the Manhattan Project, until October 1941. Even though Einstein had become an American citizen in 1940, the authorities considered him a security risk because of his political views. He was never asked to work on the atomic bomb. Bohr was. On the 22nd of December 1943, he stopped off at Princeton on his way to Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the bomb was being built. Los Alamos. He had dinner with Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli. who had joined the Institute for Advanced Study in 1940. Much had happened since the last time Bohr met Einstein. In April 1940, German forces occupied Denmark. Bohr chose to remain in Copenhagen, hoping that his international reputation would provide some semblance of protection to others at his institute, and it did until August 1943, when the illusion of Danish self-rule was finally shattered, as the Nazis declared martial law after the government rejected a demand that a state of emergency be declared and acts of sabotage be punishable by death. Then, on the 28th of September, Hitler ordered the deportation of Denmark's 8,000 Jews. A sympathetic German official informed two Danish politicians that the roundup was to begin at 9 p.m. on the 1st of October. As word quickly spread of the Nazi plan, almost every Jew disappeared, hidden in the homes of fellow Danes or finding sanctuary in churches or disguised as patients in hospitals. The Nazis managed to round up fewer than 300 Jews. Bohr, whose mother had been Jewish, managed to escape to Sweden with his family. From there he flew to Scotland in a British bomber, almost dying from a lack of oxygen because he was traveling in the Bombay and had an ill-fitting oxygen mask. After meeting British politicians, he soon traveled to America, where after his fleeting visit to Princeton, he worked on the atomic bomb under the alias Nicholas Baker. Are you still recording? Hell yeah, you are hot. Your phone, you are hot. Not you, the viewer. The phone is very warm. How long has it been? 17 minutes. Holy. After the war, Bohr returned to the Institute in Copenhagen, and Einstein said he felt no friendship for any real German. Yet he had unabiding sympathy for Planck, who outlived all four of his children from his first marriage. The death of his younger son was the bitterest of all the blows Planck endured in his long life. Erwin, an Undersecretary of State in the Reich Chancellery before the Nazis came to power, was a suspect in an attempt to assassinate Hitler in July 1944. He was arrested and tortured by the Gestapo and found guilty of complicity in the assassination plot. At one point, there was a glimmer of hope as Planck set, in his words, heaven and hell in motion to have the death penalty commuted to a prison sentence. Then, without warning, Erwin was hanged in Berlin in February 1945. Planck had been denied the opportunity to see his son one last time. He was a precious part of my being. He was my sunshine, my pride, my hope. No words can describe what I have lost with him. When he heard the news that Planck had died, aged 89, following a stroke on the 4th of October 1947, Einstein wrote to the widow of the beautiful and fruitful time he had been privileged to spend with him. As he offered his condolence, Einstein recalled that the hours which I was permitted to spend at your house and the many conversations which I conducted face-to-face with that wonderful man will remain among my most beautiful recollections for the rest of my life. It was something, he reassured her, which could not be altered by the fact that a tragic fate tore us apart. After the war, Bohr was made a permanent non-resident member of the Institute for Advanced Study and could come and stay whenever he wanted to. Whenever he wanted. Why is there an extra 2? His first trip in September 1946 was brief, as he came to take part in the bicentennial celebrations of the founding of Princeton. Then, in 1948, he arrived in Germany and stayed until June. This time, Einstein was willing to talk physics. Abraham Pais, a young Dutch physicist who helped Bohr during his visit, later described the occasion when the dame came bursting into his office in a state of angry despair, saying, "I am sick of myself." When Pais asked what was wrong, Bohr replied that he had been to see Einstein and said they had gotten into an argument about the meaning of quantum mechanics. Only 3 more pages. The renewal of their friendship was signaled by the fact that Einstein let Bohr use his office. One day, Bohr was dictating a draft of a paper in honor of Einstein's 70th birthday to Pius. Stuck on what to say next, Bohr stood looking out the window, every now and then muttering Einstein's name aloud. At the moment, Einstein tiptoed into the office. His doctor had banned him from buying any tobacco, but had said nothing about stealing it. Pius later recounted what happened next. Always on tiptoes, he made a beeline for Bohr's tobacco pot, which stood on the table at which I was sitting. Bohr, unaware, was standing at the window, muttering, "Einstein, Einstein." I was at a loss for what to do, especially because I had at that moment not the faintest idea of what Einstein was up to. Then Bohr, with a firm Einstein, turned around. There they were, face to face, as if Bohr had summoned him forth. It is an understatement to say that for a moment Bohr was speechless. I myself, who had seen it coming, had distinctly felt uncanny for a moment, but so I could well understand Bohr's own reaction. A moment later, the spell was broken when Einstein explained his mission. Soon we were all bursting with laughter. What a sweet moment. There were other visits to Princeton, but Bohr never managed to get Einstein to change his mind on quantum mechanics. Nor did Heisenberg, who saw him only once after the war, during a lecture tour of the United States that overlapped with Bohr's last visit in 1954. Einstein invited Heisenberg to his home, and over coffee and cakes, they chatted for most of the afternoon. Of politics we said nothing, recalled Heisenberg. Einstein's whole interest focused on the interpretation of quantum theory, which continued to disturb him, just as it had done in Brussels 25 years before. Einstein remained resolute. "I don't like your kind of physics," he said. The necessity of conceiving of nature as an objective reality is said to be superannuated prejudice, while the quantum theoreticians are vaunted. Einstein had once written to his old friend Maurice Solavine, "Men are even more susceptible to suggestion than horses, and each period is dominated by a mood, with the result that the most men fail to see the tyrant who rules over them." And that's a break. We have like 2 more pages in the chapter, and then we have 2 more full-on chapters here. Man, we're on page 326. End is at 360. Do I want to finish this today? Only 23 minutes. Oh boy. Alright, I'm gonna change position. My right arm is literally kind of fucked. I'm gonna move you. That's good shit. You are at the edge of the table, though. I'm quite worried as to what would happen if you fell down. Yeah, I think it's fine, as long as I don't move too much. When Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, died in November 1952, the Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, felt compelled to offer Einstein the presidency. "I am deeply moved by the offer from our state of Israel, and at once saddened and ashamed because I cannot accept it," said Einstein. He highlighted the fact that he lacked both the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people and to exercise official functions. "For these reasons alone," he explained, "I should be unsuited to fulfill the duties of high office, even if advancing age was not making increasing inroads on my strength." Ever since December of 1950, when doctors discovered that his aortic aneurysm, a bulge in the aorta, was getting larger, Einstein knew he was living on borrowed time. He wrote his will and made it clear that he wanted to be cremated after a private funeral. He lived to celebrate his 76th birthday, and one of his last acts was to sign a declaration written by the philosopher Bertrand Russell, calling for nuclear disarmament. Einstein wrote to Bohr asking him to sign it. Don't frown like that. This has nothing to do with our old controversy on physics, but rather concerns a matter on which we are in complete agreement. On the 13th of April, 1955, Einstein experienced severe chest pains, and 2 days later he was taken to hospital. I want to go when I want, he said, refusing surgery. It is tasteless to prolong a life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. As fate would have it, his stepdaughter Margot was staying in the same hospital. She saw Einstein twice, and they chatted for a few hours. Hans Albert, who had arrived in America with his family in 1937, rushed from Berkeley in California to his father's bedside. For a while, Einstein seemed better and asked for his notes, unable to abandon his search for unified field theory even at the end. Shortly after 1 a.m. in the 18th of April, the aneurysm burst. After saying a few words in German that the night nurse could not understand, Einstein died. Later that day, he was cremated, but not before his brain was removed and his ashes scattered at an undisclosed location. If everyone lived a life like mine, there would be no need for novels, Einstein once wrote to his sister. The year was 1899 and he was 20. Except for the fact that he was the greatest physicist since Newton, said Banesh Hoffman, one of Einstein's Princeton assistants, one might almost say that he was not so much a scientist as an artist of science. Bohr paid his own heartfelt tribute. He recognized Einstein's achievements to be just as rich and fruitful as any in the whole history of our culture, and said that mankind will always be indebted to Einstein for the removal of the obstacles to our outlook, which were involved in the primitive notions of absolute space and time. He gave us a world pictured with a unity and harmony surpassing the boldest dreams of the past. The Einstein-Bohr debate did not end with Einstein's death. Bohr would argue as if his old quantum foe was still alive. I can still see Einstein's smile, both knowing, humane, and friendly. His first thought when thinking about some fundamental issue in physics was to wonder what Einstein would have said about it. On Saturday, the 17th of November, 1962, Bohr gave the last of 5 interviews concerning his role in the development of quantum physics. After lunch on Sunday, Bohr went to take his usual nap. When he called out, his wife Marguerite rushed to the bedroom and found him unconscious. Bohr, aged 77, had suffered a fatal heart attack. The last drawing on the blackboard in his study, made the night before as he replayed the argument over once more, was of Einstein's light box. And that's the end of the chapter, and the end of part 3. Now we end to part 4 now. Part 4. Does God play dice? And there's a single quote, and it is by the Albert Einstein. I want to know how God created this world. I am not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details. Chapter 14. For whom Bell's theorem tolls. How long is this? Oh, 19. And the next one is only 9 pages. Okay. So we have 29 pages. I think that's... I was about to say doable, but... my memories are reminding me what regrets await me. Okay. You believe in the God who plays dice, and I, in complete law and order, in a... What the fuck is this? You believe in the God who plays dice, and I, in complete law and order, in a world which objectively exists, and which I, in a wildly speculative way, am trying to capture. Gee whiz, what the hell? You believe in the God who plays dice, and I, in complete law and order, in a world which objectively exists, and which I, in a wildly speculative way, am trying to capture, Einstein wrote to Bohr in 1944. I firmly believe, but I hope that someone will discover a more realistic way, or rather a more tangible basis, than it has been my lot to find. Even the great initial success of quantum theory does not make me believe in the fundamental dice game, although I am well aware that our younger colleagues interpret this as a consequence of senility. No doubt the day will come when we shall see whose instinctive attitude was the correct one. 20 years passed since before discovery brought that day of judgment closer. In 1964, the radio astronomers Arzo Penzias and Robert Wadlow detected the echo of the Big Bang. The evolutionary biologist Bill Hamilton published his theory of the genetic evolution of social behavior, and the theoretical physicist Murray Gell-Mann predicted the existence of a new family of fundamental particles called quarks. These were just three of the landmark scientific breakthroughs that year. Yet according to the physicist and historian of science Henry Stopp, none rivaled Bell's theorem, the most profound discovery of science, but it was ignored. Most physicists were too busy using quantum mechanics as it continued to notch up one success after another to be bothered about the subtleties of these arguments between Einstein and Bohr over its meaning and interpretation. It is little wonder they failed to recognize that a 34-year-old Irish physicist, John Stuart Bell, had discovered what Einstein and Bohr could not, a mathematical theorem that could decide between the two opposing philosophical worldviews. For Bohr, there was no quantum world, only an abstract quantum mechanical description. Einstein believed in a reality independent of perception. The debate between Einstein and Bohr was as much about the kind of physics that was acceptable as a meaningful theoretical description of reality, as it was about the nature of reality itself. Einstein was convinced that Bohr and the supporters of the Copenhagen interpretation were playing a risky game with reality. John Bell was sympathetic to Einstein's position, but part of the inspiration behind his groundbreaking theorem lay in the work done in the early 1950s by an American physicist forced into exile. I have to charge my phone, and not the one I'm using to record right now, on the other phone, which is on the other side of the room. Give me a second. David Bohm was a talented PhD student of Robert Oppenheimer's at the University of California at Berkeley. Born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in December 1917, Bohr was prevented from joining the top-secret research facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to work on the development of the atomic bomb in 1943, after Oppenheimer was appointed its director. The authorities cited Bohm's many relatives in Europe, 19 of whom were to die in Nazi concentration camps, as the reason they considered him to be a security risk. In truth, having been questioned by U.S. Army intelligence and attempting to secure his position as the scientific leader of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer had named Bohm as a possible member of the American Communist Party. 4 years later, in 1947, the self-confessed Shatterer of Worlds took charge of the Madhouse, as Oppenheimer once called the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Maybe in an attempt to atone for his earlier naming of Bohm, of which his protege was unaware, Oppenheimer helped him attain an assistant professorship at Princeton University. Amidst the anti-communist paranoia sweeping the United States after the Second World War, I'm stammering. Oppenheimer was soon under suspicion because of his earlier left-wing political views. Having watched him closely for some years, the FBI had compiled a large dossier on the man who knew America's atomic secrets. In an attempt to smear Oppenheimer, some of his friends and colleagues were investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee and forced to appear before it. In 1948, Bohm, who had joined the American Communist Party in 1942 but left after only 9 months, invoked the Fifth Amendment that protected him against self-incrimination. Within a year, he was subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury and once again pleaded the Fifth. In November 1949, Bohm was arrested, charged with contempt of court, and briefly imprisoned before being released on bail. Princeton University, worried about losing wealthy donors, suspended him. Although he was acquitted when his case came to trial in June 1950, the university chose to pay off the remaining year of Bohm's contract, provided he did not set foot on campus. Bohm was blacklisted and unable to find another academic post in the United States, and Einstein seriously considered appointing him as his research assistant. Oppenheimer opposed the idea and was among those who advised his former student to leave the country. In October 1951, Bohm left for Brazil and the University of Sao Paulo. He had been in Brazil only a matter of weeks when the American embassy, fearing that his final destination might be the Soviet Union, confiscated Bohm's passport and reissued it as valid only for travel to the United States. Worried that his South American exile would cut him off from the international physics community, Bohm acquired Brazilian nationality to circumvent the travel ban imposed by Americans. Back to the United States, Oppenheimer faced a hearing. Pressure on him intensified the moment it emerged that Klaus Fuchs, a physicist he had selected to work on the atomic bomb, was a Soviet spy. Einstein advised Oppenheimer to turn up, tell the committee they were fools, and return home. He did no such thing, but another hearing in the spring of 1954 revoked Oppenheimer's security clearance. Bohm left Brazil in 1955 and spent 2 years at the Technion Institute in Haifa, Israel, before moving to England. After 4 years at Bristol University, in 1961, Bohm settled once and for all in London after being appointed Professor of Theoretical Physics at Birkbeck College. During his troubled time in Princeton, Bohm had largely devoted himself to studying the structure and interpretation of quantum mechanics. In February 1951, he published Quantum Theory, one of the first textbooks to examine in some detail the interpretation of the theory and the EPR thought experiment. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen had conjured up an imaginary experiment that involved a pair of correlated particles, A and B, so far apart that it should be impossible for them to physically interact with one another. EPR argued that the measurement carried out on particle A could not physically disturb particle B. Since any measurement is performed on only one of the particles, EPR believed that it could cut off Bohr's counterattack, an act of measurement causes a physical disturbance. Since the properties of the two particles are correlated, they argued that by measuring a property of particle A, such as position, it is possible to know the corresponding property of B without disturbing it. EPR's aim was to demonstrate that particle B possessed the property independently of being measured, and since this was something that quantum mechanics failed to describe, it was therefore incomplete. Bohr countered, never so succinctly, that the pair of particles were entangled and form a single system no matter how far apart they were. Therefore, if you measured one, then you also measured the other. If their EPR contention could be proved, wrote Bohm, then one would be led to search for a more complete theory, perhaps containing something like hidden variables, in terms of which the present quantum theory would be a limiting case. But he concluded that quantum theory is inconsistent with the assumption of hidden causal variables. Bohm looked at quantum theory from the prevailing Copenhagen viewpoint. However, in the process of writing his book, he became dissatisfied with Bohr's interpretation, even as he agreed with the dismissal by others of the EPR argument as unjustified, and based on assumptions concerning the nature of matter which implicitly contradicted quantum theory at the outset. It was the subtlety of the EPR thought experiment, and what he came to regard as the reasonable assumptions on which it was constructed, that led Bohm to question the Copenhagen interpretation. It was a brief step for a young physicist whose contemporaries were busy using quantum theory to make their reputations rather than risking career suicide by raking over the embers of a dying fire. But Bohm was already a marked man after his appearance before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and having been suspended by Princeton, he had little left to lose. Bohm presented Einstein with a copy of Quantum Theory and discussed his reservations with Princeton's most famous resident. Encouraged to examine the Copenhagen interpretation more closely, Bohm produced two papers that appeared in January 1952. In the first of these, he publicly thanked Einstein for several interesting and stimulating discussions. By then, Bohm was in Brazil, but the papers had been written and sent to the Physical Review in July 1951, just 4 months after the publication of his book. Bohm appeared to have had a Paul-like conversion on the road, not to Damascus, but Copenhagen. In his papers, Bohm outlined an alternative interpretation of quantum theory, and argued that the mere possibility of such an interpretation proves that it is not necessary for us to give a precise, rational, and objective description of individual systems at a quantum level of accuracy. Reproducing the predictions of quantum mechanics, it was a mathematically more sophisticated and coherent version of Louis de Broglie's pilot wave model, which the French prince had abandoned after it was severely criticized at the 1927 Solvay conference. Whereas the wave function in quantum mechanics is an abstract wave of probability, in the pilot wave theory it is a real physical wave that guides particles, just as an ocean current carries along a swimmer or a ship. The pilot wave produces a current that is responsible for the motion of a particle. The particle has a well-defined trajectory determined by the precise values of position and velocity that it possesses at any given time, but which the uncertainty principle hides by preventing an experimenter from measuring them. On reading Bohm's two papers, Bell said that he saw the impossible done. Like almost everyone else, he thought that Bohm's alternative to the Copenhagen interpretation had been ruled out as impossible. He asked why no one had told him about a pilot wave theory. Why is the pilot wave picture ignored in textbooks? Should it not be taught not as the only way, but as an antidote to the prevailing complacency, to show that vagueness, subjectivity, and indeterminism are not forced on us by experimental facts, but by deliberate theoretical choice? A part of the answer was the legendary Hungarian-born mathematician John von Neumann. God, where's the break in this? Okay, it's in 3 pages. Okay, good. 2 pages. 1 page. 2.5. The eldest of 3 brothers, the Jewish banker's son, was a mathematical prodigy. When his first paper was published at 18, von Neumann was a student at Budapest University, but spent most of his time in Germany or the universities of Berlin and Göttingen, returning only to take his exams. In 1923, he enrolled at the ETH in Zurich to study chemical engineering after his father insisted that he have something more practical to fall back on than mathematics. After graduating from the ETH and gaining a doctorate from Budapest in double-quick time, von Neumann became at 23 the youngest ever Privatdozent appointed by Berlin University in 1927. 3 years later, he began teaching at Princeton University. In 1933, joined Einstein as a professor for the Institute of Advanced Study, remaining there for the rest of his life. A year earlier, in 1932, the then 28-year-old von Neumann wrote a book that became the quantum physicist's Bible, Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. In it, he asked whether quantum mechanics could be reformulated as a deterministic theory by the introduction of hidden variables, which, unlike ordinary variables, are inaccessible to measurement, and therefore not subject to the restrictions imposed by the uncertainty principle. Von Neumann argued that the present system of quantum mechanics would have to be objectively false in order that another description of the elementary processes than the statistical one may be possible. In other words, the answer was no. And he offered a mathematical proof that outlawed the hidden variables approach that Bohm would adopt 20 years later. It was an approach with a history. Ever since the 17th century, men like Robert Boyle had studied the various properties of gases at their pressure, volume, and temperature, as their pressure, volume, and temperature were varied, and had discovered the gas laws. Boyle found the laws for describing the relationship between the volume of a gas and its pressure. He established that if a certain quantity of gas were kept at a fixed temperature and its pressure was doubled, its volume was halved. If the pressure was increased threefold, then the volume was reduced to a third. At constant temperature, the volume of gas is inversely proportional to the pressure. The correct physical explanation of the gas laws had to wait until Ludwig Boltzmann and James Clerk Maxwell developed the kinetic theory of gases in the 19th century. So many of the properties of matter, especially when in gaseous form, can be deduced from the hypothesis that their minute parts are in rapid motion, the velocity increasing with temperature, wrote Maxwell in 1860, that the precise nature of this motion becomes the subject of rational curiosity. It led him to conclude that the relations between pressure, temperature, and density in the perfect gas can be explained by supposing the particles to move with uniform velocity in straight lines, striking against the sides of the containing vessel and thus producing pressure. Molecules in a continual state of motion, haphazardly colliding into one another, and the walls of the container holding the gas, produce the relationship between pressure, temperature, and volume expressed in the gas laws. Molecules can be regarded as the unobserved microscopic hidden variable that explain the observed macroscopic properties of gases. Okay. Einstein's explanation of Brownian motion in 1905 is an example where the hidden variable is the molecules of a fluid in which the pollen grains are suspended. The reason behind the erratic movement of the grains that had so perplexed everyone was suddenly clear after Einstein pointed out that it was due to the bombardment by invisible but very real molecules. The appeal of hidden variables in quantum mechanics had its roots in Einstein's claim that the theory is incomplete. Maybe that incompleteness was due to the failure to capture the existence of an underlying layer of reality. This untapped seam in the form of hidden variables, possibly hidden particles, forces, or something completely new, would restore an independent objective reality. Phenomena that at one level appear probabilistic would, with the help of hidden variables, be revealed as deterministic and particles which would possess a definite velocity and position at all times. 50 minutes, wow. As von Neumann was acknowledged as one of the great mathematicians of the day, most physicists simply accepted, without bothering to check, that he had prescribed hidden variables when it came to quantum mechanics. For them, the mere mention of von Neumann and proof was enough. However, von Neumann admitted that there remained the possibility, though small, that quantum mechanics might be wrong, in spite of the fact that quantum mechanics agrees well with experiment and that it has opened up for us a qualitatively new side of the world. One can never say of the theory that it has been proven by experience, but only that it is the best-known summarization of experience, he wrote. Yet despite these words of caution, von Neumann's proof was held to be sacrosanct. Virtually everyone misinterpreted it as proving that no theory of hidden variables could reproduce the same experimental results as quantum mechanics. When he analyzed von Neumann's argument, Bohm believed that it was wrong, but could not clearly pinpoint the weakness. Nevertheless, encouraged by his discussions with Einstein, Bohm attempted to construct the hidden variables theory that was deemed to be impossible. It would be Bell who demonstrated that one of the assumptions used by von Neumann was unwarranted, and therefore his impossibility proof was incorrect. We've got 11 pages. 20 if we want to go further. We can do this, y'all. Born in July 1928 in Belfast, John Stuart Bell was descended from a family of carpenters, blacksmiths, farm workers, laborers, and horse dealers. Horse dealers. My parents were poor but honest, he once said. Both of them came from large families of 8 or 9 that were traditional of the working class people of Ireland at the time. With a father who was in and out of work, Bell's childhood was far removed from the comfortable middle-class upbringing of the quantum pioneers. Nevertheless, before he reached his teens, the bookish Bell had earned the nickname the Prof, even before he told his family that he wanted to become a scientist. There was an older sister and 2 younger brothers, and though their mother believed that a good education was the route to future prosperity for her children, John was the only one who went to secondary school aged 11. It was not a lack of ability that denied his siblings the same opportunity, only a shortage of money for a family always struggling to make ends meet. Luckily, the family came into a small sum of money that enabled Bell to enroll at the Belfast Technical High School. Not as prestigious as some of the other schools in the city, it offered a curriculum that combined the academic and the practical that suited him. In 1944, age 16, Bell gained the qualifications necessary to study at Queen's University in his hometown. With 17, the minimum age for admission, and his parents unable to finance the university's studies, Bell looked for work and fortuitously found it as an assistant technician in the laboratory of the physics department at Queen's University. Before long, the 2 senior physicists recognized Bell's abilities and allowed him to attend the first-year lectures whenever his duties permitted. His enthusiasm and obvious talent were rewarded with a small scholarship, and this, together with the money he was able to set aside, meant that he returned after his year as a technician to a fully fledged physics student. With the sacrifices that he and his parents had made, Bell was focused and driven. He proved to be an exceptional student, and in 1948 obtained a degree in experimental physics. A year later, he gained another in mathematical physics. Bell admitted that he had had a very bad conscience about having lived off my parents for so long, and thought I should get a job. He's just like me for real. With his 2 degrees and glowing references, he went to England to work for the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Research Establishment. In 1954, Bell married a fellow physicist, Mary Ross. In 1960, after having gained a PhD from Birmingham University, he and his wife moved to CERN, the Conseil Européen pour la Recherche Nucléaire, near Geneva, Switzerland. For a man who would make his name as a quantum theorist, Bell's job was designing particle accelerators. He was proud to call himself a quantum engineer. Bell first came across von Neumann's proof in 1949, his last year as a student in Belfast, when he read Max Born's new book, Natural Philosophy of Cause and Chance. I was very impressed that somebody, von Neumann, had actually proved that you couldn't interpret quantum mechanics as some sort of statistical mechanics, he later recalled. But Bell did not read von Neumann's book as it was written in German, and he did not know that language. Instead, he accepted Born's word for the soundness of von Neumann's proof. According to Born, von Neumann had put quantum mechanics on an axiomatic basis by deriving it from a few postulates of a very plausible and general character, such that the formalism of quantum mechanics is uniquely determined by these axioms. In particular, Born said, it meant that no concealed parameters could be introduced with the help of which the indeterministic description could be transformed into a deterministic one. What a stupid sentence. Implicitly, Bohr was arguing in favor of the Copenhagen interpretation, because if a future theory should be deterministic, it cannot be a modification of the present one, but must be essentially different. Born's message was that quantum mechanics is complete, therefore it cannot be modified. It was 1955 before von Neumann's book was published in English, but by then Bell had read Bohm's papers on hidden variables. I saw that von Neumann must have just been wrong, he said later, yet Pauli and Heisenberg branded Bohm's hidden variables alternative as metaphysical and ideological. The ready acceptance of von Neumann's impossibility proof proved only one thing to Bell, a lack of imagination. Nevertheless, it had allowed Bohr and the advocates of a Copenhagen interpretation to consolidate the position even when some of them suspected the von Neumann might be wrong. Even though he later dismissed Bohm's work, Pauli in his published lectures on wave mechanics wrote that no proof of the impossibility of extending, i.e. completing quantum theory by hidden variables, has been given. For 25 years, hidden variable theories had been ruled impossible by the authority of von Neumann. However, if such a theory could be constructed to yield the same predictions as quantum mechanics, then there would be no reason for physicists to simply accept the Copenhagen interpretation. When Bohm demonstrated that such an alternative was possible, the Copenhagen interpretation was so well entrenched as the only interpretation of quantum mechanics that he was either ignored or attacked. Einstein, who had initially encouraged him, dismissed Bohm's hidden variables as too cheap. I think he was looking for a much more profound rediscovery of quantum phenomena, Bell said as he tried to understand Einstein's reaction. The idea that you could just add a few variables and the whole thing were made unchanged apart from the interpretation, which was a kind of trivial addition to ordinary quantum mechanics, must have been a disappointment to him. Bell was convinced that Einstein wanted to see some grand new principle emerge on a par with the conservation of energy. Instead, what Bohm offered Einstein was an interpretation that was non-local, requiring the instantaneous transmission of so-called quantum mechanical forces. There were other horrors lurking in Bohm's alternative. For example, clarified Bell, the trajectories that were assigned to the elementary particles were instantaneously changed when anyone moved a magnet anywhere in the universe. It was in 1964, during a year-long sabbatical from CERN and his day job designing particle accelerators, that Bell found the time to enter the Einstein-Bohr debate. Bell decided to find out if non-locality was a peculiar feature of Bohm's model, or if it was a characteristic of any hidden variable theory that aimed to reproduce the results of quantum mechanics. I knew, of course, that the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen setup was the critical one, because it led to distinct correlations. He explained. They ended their paper by stating that if you somehow completed the quantum mechanical description, non-locality would only be apparent. The underlying theory would be local. Bell started out trying to preserve locality by attempting to construct a local hidden variable theory in which if one event caused another, then there had to be enough time between the two to allow a signal traveling at the speed of light to pass between them. Everything I tried didn't work, he said later. I began to feel that it very likely couldn't be done. In his attempt to eliminate what Einstein decried as spooky actions at a distance, non-local influences that were transmitted instantly between one place or another, Bell derived his celebrated theorem. He began by looking at a version of the EPR thought experiment first devised by Bohm in 1951 that was simpler than the original. Whereas Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen had used two properties of a particle, position and momentum, Bohm only used one, quantum spin. First proposed in 1925 by the young Dutch physicists George Uhlenbeck and Samuel Goldschmidt, the quantum spin of a particle had no analog in classical physics. An electron had just two possible spin states, spin up and spin down. Bohm's adaptation of EPR involved a spin zero particle that disintegrates, and then the process reproduces two electrons, A and B. Since their combined spin must remain zero, one electron must have spin up and the other spin down, flying off in opposite directions until they are far enough apart to rule out any physical interaction between them. The quantum spin of each electron is measured at exactly the same time by a spin detector. Bell was interested in the correlations that could exist between the results of these simultaneous measurements carried out on pairs of such electrons. The quantum spin of an electron can be measured independently in any one of these three directions, at right angles to each other, labeled X, Y, and Z. These directions are just the normal three dimensions of the everyday world in which everything moves: left and right, X direction; up and down, Y direction; and back and forth, Z direction. When the spin of electron A is measured along the X direction by a spin detector placed in its path, it will either be spin up or spin down. The odds are 50-50, the same as those for flipping a coin to see whether it lands heads or tails. In both cases, whether it is one or the other is pure chance, but as with flipping a coin repeatedly, if the experiment is done again and again, then electron A will be found to have spin up in half the measurements and spin down in the rest. Unlike two coins that are flipped at the exact same time, each of which can be heads or tails, as soon as the spin of electron A is measured as spin up, then the simultaneous measurement of the spin of electron B along the same direction will reveal it to be spin down. There is a perfect correlation between the results of the two spin measurements. Bell later attempted to demonstrate that there was nothing strange about the nature of these correlations. The philosopher in the street, who has not suffered a course in quantum mechanics, is quite unimpressed by Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen correlations. He can point to many examples of similar correlations in everyday life. The case of Bertelsmann's socks is often cited. Dr. Bertelsmann likes to wear two socks of different colors. Which color he will have on a given foot on a given day is quite unpredictable. But when you see that Is it pouring outside? Hold on, let me check the weather. Oh my god. Can you hear that? It is going ballistic. Oh, where's the weather? I can't see the weather. I can't find it. Weather. Oh my god. 100% for the next 2 hours. Wonderful. Okay. I'll have a great sleep tonight. Okay. Which colors? Okay. The case of Bertelsmann's socks is often cited. Dr. Bertelsmann likes to wear two socks that are different colors. Which color he will have on a given foot on a given day is quite unpredictable. But when you see that the first sock is pink, then you can already be sure that the second sock will not be pink. Observation of the first and experience of Bertelsmann gives immediate information about the second. There is no accounting for tastes, but apart from that, there is no mystery here. And is not the EPR business the same? As with the color of Bertelsmann's socks, given that the spin of the parent particle is 0, it is no surprise that once the spin of American A along any direction is measured as spin up, the spin of electron B in the same direction is confirmed as spin down. According to Bohr, until a measurement is made, neither electron A nor electron B has a pre-existing spin in any direction. It is as if we had come to deny the reality of Bertelsmann's socks, said Bell, or at least of their colors, when not looked at. Instead, before they are observed, the electrons exist in a ghostly superposition of states, so that they are either spin up or spin up and spin down at the same time. Since the two electrons are entangled, the information concerning their spin states is given by a wave function similar to, what is that, phi? Phi equals A spin up and B spin down plus A spin down and B spin up. Electron A has no x component of spin until a measurement to determine it causes the wave function of the system A and B to collapse, and then it is either spin up or spin down. At that very moment, its entangled partner B acquires the opposite spin in the same direction, even if it is on the other side of the universe. Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation is non-local. Einstein would explain the correlations by arguing that both electrons possess definite values of quantum spin in each of the three directions, x, y, and z, whether they are measured or not. For Einstein, said Bell, these correlations simply show that the quantum theorists had been hasty in dismissing the reality of the microscopic world. Since the pre-existing spin states of the electron pair cannot be accommodated by quantum mechanics, this led Einstein to conclude that the theory was incomplete. He did not dispute the correctness of the theory, only that it was not a complete picture of physical reality at the quantum level. Einstein believed in local realism, that a particle cannot be instantly influenced by a distant event, and that its properties exist independently of any measurement. Unfortunately, Bohm's clever reworking of the original EPR experiment could not distinguish between the positions of Einstein and Bohr. Both men could account for the results of such an experiment. Bell's stroke of genius was to discover a way out of the impasse by changing the relative orientation of the two spin detectors. If the spin detectors measuring electrons A and B are aligned such that they are parallel, then there is a 100% chance. Then there is a 100% chance correlation between two sets of measurements. Whether spin up is measured by one detector, spin down is recorded by the other, and vice versa. If one of the detectors is rotated slightly, then they are no longer perfectly aligned. Now, if the spin states of many pairs of entangled electrons are measured, when A is found to be spin up, the corresponding measurement of the partner B will sometimes also be spin up. Increasing the angle of orientation between the detectors results in a reduction in the degree of correlation. If the detectors are 90 degrees to each other, and the experiment is once again repeated many times, when A is measured along the x-axis as spin up, only in half of these instances will B be detected as spin down. If the detectors are oriented at 180 degrees to each other, then the pair of electrons will be completely anti-correlated. If A's spin state is measured as spin up, then B's will also be spin up. Although a thought experiment, it was possible to calculate the exact degree of spin correlation for a given orientation of the detectors predicted by quantum mechanics. However, it was not possible to do a similar calculation using an archetypal hidden variables theory that preserved locality. The only thing that such a theory would predict was a less than perfect match between spin states of A and B. This was not enough to decide between quantum mechanics and a local hidden variables theory. Bell knew that any actual experiment that found spin correlations in line with the predictions of quantum mechanics could easily be disputed. After all, it was possible that in the future someone might develop a hidden variables theory that also exactly predicted the spin correlations for different orientations of the detectors. The rain is making me slur. Ugh. Bell then made an astonishing discovery. It was possible to decide between the predictions of quantum mechanics and any local hidden variables theory by measuring the correlations of pairs of electrons for a given setting of the spin detectors and then repeating the experiment with a different orientation. This enabled Bell to calculate the total correlation for both sets of orientations in terms of the individual results predicted by any local hidden variables theory. Since in any such theory, the outcome of a measurement in one detector cannot be affected by what is measured at the other, it is possible to distinguish between hidden variables and quantum mechanics. Bell was able to calculate the limits on the degree of spin correlation between pairs of entangled electrons in a Bohm-modified EPR experiment. He found that in the ethereal realm of the quantum, there is a greater level of correlation if quantum mechanics reigns supreme than in any world that depends on hidden variables and locality. Bell's theorem said that no hidden local variables theory could reproduce the same set of correlations as quantum mechanics. Any local hidden variables theory would lead to spin correlations that generated numbers, called the correlation coefficients, between -2 and +2. However, for certain orientations of the spin detectors, quantum mechanics predicted correlation coefficients that lay outside the range known as Bell's inequality, that ran from -2 to +2. Although Bell, with his rare red hair and pointed beard, was difficult to miss, his extraordinary theorem was ignored. This was hardly surprising, since in 1964 the journal to get noticed in was the Physical Review, published by the American Physical Society. The problem for Bell was that the Physical Review charged, and it was your university that usually paid the bill once your paper was accepted. As a guest at Stanford University in Columbia at the time, Bell did not want to abuse the hospitality he had been shown by asking the university to pay. Instead, his 6-page paper on the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox was published in the 3rd issue of Physics, a little-read, short-lived journal that actually paid its contributors. In fact, this was the 2nd paper that Bell wrote during his sabbatical year. The first reconsidered the verdict of von Neumann and others that quantum mechanics does not permit a hidden variable interpretation. Unfortunately, misfiled by the Review of Modern Physics, with a letter from the editor going astray causing a further delay, the paper was not published until July 1966. It was, wrote Bell, aimed at those who believe in the question concerning the existence of such hidden variables, received as early. It was, wrote Bell, aimed at those who believed that the question concerning the existence of such hidden variables received an early and rather decisive answer in the form of It was, wrote Bell, aimed at those who believed that the question concerning the existence of such hidden variables received an early and rather decisive answer in the form of von Neumann's proof in the mathematical impossibility of such variables of quantum theory. He went on to show once and for all that von Neumann had been wrong. A scientific theory that does not agree with experimental facts will either be modified or discarded. Quantum mechanics, however, had passed every test it had been subject to. There was no conflict between theory and experiment. For the vast majority of Bell's colleagues, young and old alike, the dispute between Einstein and Bohr over the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics was more philosophy than physics. They shared Pauli's view, expressed in a letter to Born in 1954, that one should no more rack one's brain about the problem of whether something one cannot know anything about exists all the same than about the ancient question of how many angels are able to sit on the point of a needle. To Pauli, it seemed that Einstein's questions are ultimately always of this kind in his critique of the Copenhagen interpretation. Bell's theorem changed that. It allowed the local reality advocated by Einstein, that the quantum world exists independently of observation, and that physical effects cannot be transmitted faster than the speed of light, to be tested against Bohr's Copenhagen interpretation. Bell had brought the Einstein-Bohr debate into a new arena, experimental philosophy. If Bell's inequality held, then Einstein's contention that quantum mechanics was incomplete would be right. However, should the inequality be violated, then Bohr would emerge the victor. No more thought experiments. It was Einstein versus Bohr in the laboratory. And that's a quite good break. Half, 1, 2, 3. 3.5 pages to the end of this chapter. Oh, fuck. It was Bell who first challenged the experimentalist to put his inequality to the test, when he wrote in 1964 that it requires little imagination to envisage the measurements involved actually being made. But like Gustav Kirchhoff and his imaginary black body a century earlier, it is easier for a theorist to envisage an experiment than for his colleagues to realize it in practice. 5 years passed before Bell received a letter in 1969 from a young physicist in Berkeley in California. John Clauser, then 26, explained that he and others had devised an experiment to test the inequality. 2 years earlier, Clauser had been a doctoral student at New York Columbia University when he first came across Bell's inequality. Convinced that it was worth testing, Clauser went to see his professor and was bluntly told that no decent experimentalist would ever go to the effort of actually trying to measure it. It was a reaction in keeping with the near-universal acceptance of quantum theory and its Copenhagen interpretation as gospel, Clauser wrote later, along with a total unwillingness to even mildly question the theory's foundations. Nevertheless, by the summer of 1969, Clauser had devised an experiment with the help of Michael Horn, Abner Shimony, and Richard Holt. It required the quartet to fine-tune Bell's inequality so that it could be tested in a real laboratory rather than in the imaginary laboratory of the mind, equipped with perfect instruments. Clauser's search for a postdoctoral position took him to the University of California at Berkeley, where he had to settle for a job doing radio astronomy. Luckily, when Clauser explained to his new boss the experiment he really wanted to perform, he was allowed to devote half of his time to it. Clauser found a willing graduate student, Stuart Friedman, to help. Instead of electrons, Clauser and Friedman used pairs of correlated photons in their experiment. The switch was possible because photons have a property called polarization that, for the purposes of the test, played the same role as quantum spin. Although a simplification, a photon can be regarded as being polarized either up or down, just like electrons and spin. If the polarization of one photon along the x direction is measured as up, then the other will be measured as down, since the combined polarizations of both photons must be zero. The reason for employing photons rather than electrons is that they are easier to produce in the laboratory, especially since the experiment would involve numerous pairs of particles being measured. It was 1972 before Clauser and Friedman were ready to put Bell's inequality to the test. They heated calcium atoms until they acquired enough energy for an electron to jump from the ground state to a higher energy level. As the electron fell back down to the ground state, it did so in 2 stages and emitted a pair of entangled photons, one green and the other blue. The photons were sent in opposite directions until detectors simultaneously measured their polarizations. The 2 detectors were initially oriented at 22.5 degrees relative to each other for the first set of measurements, and then realigned at 67.5 degrees for the second set. Clauser and Friedman found, after 200 hours of measurements, that the level of photon correlations violated Bell's inequality. It was a result in favor of Bohr's non-local Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics with its spooky action at a distance, and against the local reality backed by Einstein. But there was a serious reservations as to the validity of the outcome. Between 1972 and 1977, different teams of experimenters conducted 9 separate trials of Bell's inequality. It was violated in only 7. Given these mixed results, there were misgivings concerning the accuracy of the experiments. One problem was the inefficiency of the detectors that resulted in only a small fraction of the total number of pairs generated being measured. No one knew precisely what effect this had on the level of correlations. There were other loopholes that needed to be closed before it could be conclusively shown for whom Bell's theorem told. As Clauser and others were busy planning and executing their experiments, a French physics graduate was doing voluntary work in Africa and spending his spare time reading up on quantum mechanics. It was while working his way to an influential French textbook on the subject that Alain Aspect first became fascinated by the EPR thought experiment. After reading Bell's seminal papers, he began thinking about subjecting Bell's inequality to a rigorous test. In 1974, after 3 years in Cameroon, Aspect returned to France. 27-year-old set about making his African dream come true in a basement laboratory at the Institut d'Optique Théorique et Appliquée, Université Paris-Sud in Orsay. "Do you have a permanent position?" Bell asked when Aspect went to see him in Geneva. Aspect explained that he was just a graduate student aiming for a doctorate. "You must be a very courageous graduate student," replied Bell. He was concerned that the young Frenchman could be damaging his future prospects by attempting to conduct such a difficult experiment. It took longer than he imagined at the outset, but in 1981 and 1982, Aspect and his collaborators used the latest technological innovations, including lasers and computers, to perform not one but 3 delicate experiments to test Bell's inequality. Like Clauser, Aspect measured the correlation of the polarizations of entangled pairs of photons moving in opposite directions after being simultaneously emitted from individual calcium atoms. However, the rate at which photon pairs were created and measured was many times higher. His experiments revealed, said Aspect, the strongest violation of Bell's inequalities ever achieved, an excellent agreement with quantum mechanics. Bell was one of the examiners when Aspect received his doctorate in 1983, but some doubts remained concerning the results. Since the nature of quantum reality hung in the balance, every possible loophole, however improbable, had to be considered. For example, the possibility that the detectors might somehow be signaling to each other was later eliminated by the random switching of their orientation while the photons were in mid-flight. Although it fell short of being the definitive experiment, further refinements and other investigations in the years since have led to Aspect's original results being confirmed. Although no experiment has been conducted in which every